Welcome back to the second session of the day. On behalf of JLF Colorado, Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, Festival producer Sanjay K. Roy, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, Boulder Public Library, and the City of Boulder, we welcome you to this session of JLF Colorado 2021 Virtual Festival. Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs. Camilla Townsend, in conversation with Eliga Gould. Our knowledge and information of the Aztec Empire, their history, and their conquest for generations has been delivered to us by the Western pen. Author and historian Camilla Townsend's Cundill History Prize-winning Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs, brings to light a complex and riveting history of the Aztecs, based entirely on direct translations of the Annals written in the neglected Nahuatl language. Camilla Townsend. Camilla Townsend is a distinguished professor of history at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey in the United States. A specialist in the Nahuatl or the Aztec language, she is the author of numerous books, the most recent being The Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs, which won the 2021 Cundill Prize. Eliga Gould. Eliga Gould is a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. His most recent book is Among the Powers of the Earth, the American Revolution and the Making of a New World Empire, that was named the Library Journal Best Book of the Year and received the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic's Book Prize. It was also a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize with a Japanese language edition published in 2016. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. In these difficult times, we have struggled to bring you JLF Colorado without charging a registration fee. Please support as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. You can support us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your support is greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs. Camilla Townsend, in conversation with Eliga Gould. Over to you, Eliga.
Well, thank you very much. What a pleasure it is to be here with you all. The only regret I'm sure everyone is saying is that we can't be in person. But one of the wonderful things about Zoom is it makes possible gathering in ways that would be more difficult sometimes. So anyway, well, it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Camilla Townsend about her wonderful book, Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs. And I had the pleasure of reading this as a member of the Cundill Prize Committee, and I think there was no question from right at the outset what our choice was going to be. It's a wonderful book, Camilla. Congratulations on what a wonderful accomplishment.
Thank you. I think you exaggerate its merits, but thank you very much.
Well, actually, I'm going to start with the praise every historian wants, but it's not usually the first thing that shows up. So my son, a recent college graduate, a history major, and I occasionally will hand him books that I think he would enjoy. Oftentimes I miss the mark, but about a week later, I got a text and he said, "What an amazing book. She can really tell a story." So, you know, if you can reach that demographic, you've really achieved something. Forget the Nahuatl translations and the Mexica knowledge of history. That's the sweet spot. So, it's a beautifully written book, and really, you know, I think one of the things that really struck me is it almost has a novelistic quality. That, I mean, you do tell a story. Is that something that you were conscious of when you were writing it?
I think I can fairly say that it was. That is, the idea that I had a few years earlier when I was working with the sources, writing another book, a book for scholars, the idea that I had was that someone ought to write the book that they would want written. I mean, the way they told history was a bit different than we do it now in our Western style books, you know, between covers for undergraduate and general audiences. But I thought someone ought to write the stories that they would recognize. And so I set out to do that, not just using the Nahuatl language sources, but trying to put things in terms that they would appreciate. Now, it is true that they would tell stories a bit differently. They liked to cover the same ground a few times from different points of view. And I didn't go to that extreme because I wasn't trying to, there's a famous Japanese filmmaker whose name I suddenly can't say, of course, right, who does that in his work. And I wasn't trying to do that. So I don't mean that I really tried to imitate the style directly, but I did try to tell a story because that's what they liked to do. They liked to convey information through stories. I think a secondary goal was to try to show that there was a plot, a beginning, middle, and end, and then another beginning sort of thing, because there has tended to be a sense on the part of us Western types that we can't tell that story, and that perhaps it was an unchanging world at any rate. I mean, it's been a long time since Eric Wolf wrote Europe and the People Without History. So it's not that we really needed to be convinced that they had history, but I think on an unconscious level, many readers did not assume that the Aztecs had a complex changing history that was a story. So there was a political motive as well. But yes, I did try to write it so that it would be readable for multiple reasons. The result of that is that, in fact, I think it will not be taken as the tome, the be all and end all work about the Aztecs, because it doesn't have that flavor. But someone else can write that.
Well, actually, I think the best history is open-ended. Because of course we keep coming to histories from our own perspective. Of course, one of the perspectives that we are in the 500th anniversary of the Spanish conquest of the Mexica Empire, the Aztec Empire. And I'm wondering, obviously you were writing this before that, though were you conscious of writing a book that would appear around the time of that hugely important landmark?
I was, to the extent, the book would have been written anyway. What the anniversary meant was that I hurried. The press made me hurry because what they didn't want was for this to come out several years after the world had had a big conversation about the Aztecs, or the Mexica, as you say, as they called themselves. Right. So yes, that was there. I have found, interestingly, that in Mexico, it is a big deal. Obviously, I mean, the 500th anniversary. I have found that in the international press, less attention has been paid to that than I thought would be the case. And I don't know if that's sort of myopia, in that that is, the Europeans and United States citizens tend to be less interested in Mexico and other relatively disempowered nations, or if it's all part of the effort to sort of disempower or take power from the usual anniversaries, the usual monuments, the usual, the conquistador story. So perhaps people have been aware of it and have chosen not to talk about it as much as might have been the case because they don't want to do or say anything that might seem to glorify Hernando Cortez or anybody like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We've actually seen some of the same in the North American version of this, which is the founding of Plymouth. And that's been a remarkably unremarked upon moment, very different from Jamestown's 400th anniversary in 27. So, yeah,
very
it's an interesting question. Yeah, so... so this is, the long title, which you've already heard, Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs. You've already spoken a bit to this, but a new history, I'm sure that's quite intentional. I mean, we always say what we're doing is new, but
right.
In your case, I think you can actually say it's true.
Well, I mean, yes, it's something like that had to be in the subtitle. And this is why, as scholars of Mexico or of early Native American peoples know, there have been many studies of the Aztecs. And in fact, even the general public is aware that there are a bunch of books out there on the shelf. Mm-hmm. So on one hand, it's an overwritten topic, if anything. The problem is, or was, that most of those studies are based on, I guess, one of three elements: either Spanish sources, that traditionally has been the most common, okay? Also some on archaeology, but of course what the archaeologists mostly have accessible to them are the religious artifacts, that is the the detritus of the ceremony of cutting the human heart out. So that doesn't create a full and holistic picture. And then thirdly, and this is what's a bit more complicated, there have been other books written about the Aztecs based on Aztec language or Nahuatl language sources. And yet I say mine is different, mine is new. The reason is that the sources that people have tended to use that were written in Nahuatl were those that were produced by the Nahuas hand in hand with the friars or other Spaniards. So, the Spaniards would ask the questions literally, and the indigenous would answer, and then this would be written up, often in Nahuatl, but with a Spanish language gloss or even direct translation, and then sent back to Europe. This is quite different. The Annals, or the Xupohuali, as they're called in Nahuatl, were written by the Nahuas for their own children and grandchildren in their own language based on a traditional genre. The Spaniards did not even know for a long time that they were writing these down. And they're harder for us Westerners or scholars to read because they weren't organized and set forth, put down by Spaniards. So it really is based on a set of sources that have been vastly underrepresented, underused. Okay? Not only that they're in Nahuatl, but that they're in Nahuatl produced by Nahuas for Nahuas, which is a whole different thing. Okay?
Right.
But it's complicated because understandably, many people will quickly say to me, "Oh, Camilla, you know very well that there have been many great historians who have written about the Nahuas," and that is true. There's an Australian woman who died recently, Inga Clendinen, and a great Mexican, well, a whole series of great Mexicans, but the most recent, who died most recently, is Miguel Leon Portilla, a truly great man. So there has been this work, but again, it was based on indigenous language sources produced with, sort of literally produced by Spaniards, if you will. Okay, right. And that does create a different sense. Okay.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and of course, this is a problem that recurs in any history of the Americas. This problem of mediation, it actually happens across the board. People representing what illiterate whites said. You're always going to get translation in there, but obviously you're dealing with multiple layers of meaning. And you already referred to one of the challenges, which is that in telling the story, you wanted to tell a story as a Nahuatl speaker might have told it, but if you go too far down that road, you're going to lose intelligibility for a Western reader.
That's exactly right. Often I've thought all the problems that I have with sources are the problems that all historians have, just in a more extreme and visible form. There's almost an advantage to it, and it makes it sort of easier to talk about and explain to others, because people can quickly see, yes, that would be an issue. It's harder for someone like you, who might be reading the work of a semi-literate shoemaker or something like that. Right. Right, exactly.
Right. Yeah. You've got a kind of a feeling maybe what this Bostonian's thinking, but you don't want to. Maybe that's too much of a leap, but it's certainly too much of a leap with a novice speaker.
In my case, right.
Yeah. So one other thing that I'm heaping praise, but it's well deserved. I loved one of the really interesting things about the book is you let the reader into the research process and the translation process. There's a discussion of Nahuatl. There's a pronunciation guide. My son and I were actually in a store after he read it, and we saw a pronunciation guide on a bag of tortillas, and we said, "I think that's wrong." I don't know if it's a debated, contested pronunciation, but we were going to give Professor Townsend the last word. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. I mean, so often foreign languages can be barriers, and I'm sorry to say historians oftentimes use them that way. I understand this, you don't, so I'm going to tell you what it says. And I think you really resist that. Instead, you almost invite the reader in to talk about this.
Thank you so much, Elijah. That's probably my favorite comment that I've ever gotten on the book. I really did want to do that. That is, I find a real weakness in the field of, shall I say, Mesoamerican studies. So I can include Central America and Mexico, early, modern. A real weakness, well, this would be true amongst Mayanists, it's all over the place, is that scholars are so proud of what they have learned to read, or either the language they have studied or the glyphs they have studied, that they want to show off just a bit. And that's an understandable human urge, but it doesn't help at all. If the goal is to demonstrate that we're talking about human beings here, folks, just like all other historians are, all scholars, well, I think just about all scholars these days would give lip service to the idea that we're all human here. But some are so interested in exaggerating cultural difference, or focusing only on cultural differences, perhaps better put, or on emphasizing that they themselves have sort of passed through the screen of unknowability through their linguistic genius, that the works that are produced can end up, ironically, I think in most cases the scholars would not want this, but they can end up exoticizing the people that they're writing about even more. I know that as a professor, I have trouble finding materials that I'm willing to assign to my students, not because it's all wrong, most of it is right, but the students will just end up feeling like, oh, now I really don't know these people, these Aztecs, these Mayans, whatever. So I really wanted to write a book showing how anyone can do it. Now, it's true that not everyone has the time or energy or perhaps even skill set to learn an indigenous language. I don't mean to exaggerate, but on the other hand, most people could go partway down that path. Right.
Yes, and actually that was one of the things I believe I read correctly, that you were something of a latecomer to Nahuatl. I mean, it's not a language that most high schools teach. There might be some very enlightened, privileged ones where it is, but certainly not in central Pennsylvania where I grew up.
Right. No, and in fact, I was studying comparative history. I was already interested in indigenous people, but that was not even my focus. I was more interested in comparative economic history between North and South America. And I was a young professor, a brand new professor at Colgate University in upstate New York. Yeah. And I got a memo. The older folks in the audience will remember the days when there was no internet that was really used anyway, and information passed through memos. I got a memo about a special course in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, that was to be offered that summer. And I wanted to study it because I was working on a book on Malinche, the woman who translated Fernando Cortez, the indigenous woman. And so I knew she didn't write anything, and I didn't imagine this would introduce new sources, but I thought I shouldn't be writing a book about this woman's head when I don't even know how to say good morning in her language. So I went for that reason. And then I discovered I could really do this. And I discovered there are sources not written by Malinche, but by plenty of other Nahuas. So I at that point, I was in my early 30s then, although I am sorry to say that was more than 20 years ago now, so it has been a long time, but I was a full adult when I started this, so it is doable.
Yeah, interesting, yeah. So you mentioned Malinche, she's sometimes also rendered Malintzin, isn't she?
Yeah. Right, the Spaniards christened her Marina, the indigenous heard Malina. They added their honorific, and so you get Malintzin. That's how she's known in all the native language sources. But the Spaniards couldn't do the z, so they called her, or referred to the name as Malinche, or Malinchi sometimes. And interestingly, because the indigenous were always addressing the Spaniards through her, they were always saying Malintzin, they called the Spaniards Malintzin too. So they thought Cortez's and Bernal Diaz's and all the conquistadors were also named Malinche, but it's all the same person.
Okay, yeah, so I figured as much. I think in the textbook that I teach in the Early American Survey, we of course start with this event, and I actually want to come back to that if we have time. But of course, Malinche is a central figure in that account. Because you'd written about her previously, and like you, I've spent all my life writing more or less about, it's not all about just one thing, but I'm always struck when oftentimes you come back to a topic you've written about before and you see that topic or person in a different way. And I'm wondering, Malinche, she's so important as a translator, between Nahuatl and Spanish. And did you find that your view of her changed as a result of this, or was she sort of a familiar anchor around which to build this new story?
I would say both. That is, when I got to the Conquest chapters, because as you know, in the Fifth Son, the Conquest is pivotal. It's right in the middle, but it's not the end of everything. So when I got to that high drama section, she was, as you put it, a familiar anchor. Although I realized then, as I was working, I had learned more about her since I wrote the book. My Nahuatl had gotten better. I knew more of the Shupawali, more of the Annals, almost by heart. And I realized that something that I said in the first book, in a kind of offhanded, maybe sort of way, was definitely true, and that more should be made of it. That is, she really was trying, I believe, based on the sources, trying to save Indigenous lives. She was one of the first ones, and this makes sense. She was one of the first to recognize what kind of power the Spaniards the Europeans in general, were going to have in their world. Okay? And various Indigenous annals talk about this and what she said about it. And by the time I wrote Fifth Son, I was more aware of all of that. So it was nice to see that shifting. The other thing is that, of course, when I wrote Fifth Son, I was focusing on the Aztecs and especially the royal family. Right. So by then I was more interested in Tecuichpotzin, the daughter of Moctezuma. And so Malintzin, she looked a little different. Right. When you're looking at the world suddenly through the eyes of this beleaguered, conquered princess. Now Malintzin is a powerful enemy.
Right. Well, of course, one of the questions which you talk about is, how do we see Malinche? I mean, she can be seen as a hero. I mean, she clearly talk about an Indigenous woman with agency, and yet there are ways in which she can also be seen as a betrayer. And
traditionally, and in fact, even now, there's still discussion in Mexico. She has been understood to be a betrayer because she was working for the Spaniards. But what most people don't realize when they take that view is that she herself had been sold into slavery by the Aztecs. She was not an Aztec, she was somebody else. She just spoke their language because of the accident of her birth. So she was sold into slavery by the Aztecs and then was given, she had no choice in the matter, given to the Spaniards. So when she then chose to translate for them rather than be violated by them, it makes perfect sense in that context. And she does not appear to be a traitor in the same way as she does if you don't know that. Okay.
Right. So. Yes. No. That's yeah, very interesting. And of course, you know, again, you're approaching her from a slightly different standpoint in Fifth Son than you did in your earlier work. So that's always really exciting to see how that changed. So one question, and it's hovered over a couple of things that have come up. My own native first field is the history of political thought. And one of the things that from that field you learn is that conquest, which I think at least North Americans tend to think of as a kind of absolute triumph, in fact, is rarely that way. Conquest actually, ironically, are oftentimes negotiated in one way or another, and the conquered certainly don't disappear. And you know, I think that is a theme that comes through in Fifth Son very powerfully. I mean, the Aztecs are on one hand conquered; it's undeniable, and yet it's not a total victory for the Spanish.
In fact, I really want to underscore all the marvelous contributions of my colleagues in the field of colonial Latin America in the last 20 to 30 years. They have made that point abundantly. So I was able to just borrow from them that the Indigenous did not disappear. And in fact, in a cultural sense, were not conquered. They were in a political and military sense, though. And interestingly, I think, if anything, I had the task in this book of walking a fine line, and that the general public tends to assume that the Aztecs were fully conquered, that as you were just alluding to. And so I needed to show how very vibrant they were afterwards. Whereas my colleagues in the last 20 to 30 years have gotten so good at making that point that they have sometimes tended to forget, oh, but they were conquered. Right. They were left paying all the taxes, supporting the Spaniards, giving up their wealth, their freedom, etc. So my task was to kind of try to gently correct both sides in a sense, or show that both there's truth on both in looked at from both perspectives. Okay.
Yes, no, and you did that very well. I'll say, again, the early American survey, which I'm teaching, tends to start with the Spanish conquest of Mexico, which is kind of surprising because then we moved to North America. But so it's a particular challenge for people who are not experts in the field to deal with because there is a sweet spot here, but it can be hard to find. One of the other questions that I think is very, very challenging, and you alluded to it earlier, discussing archaeological sources, there's some very difficult moral questions that come up here. So you talk about the cutting out of the heart ritual.
Right.
I was blown away by the deftness with which you dealt with that. You acknowledged that it happened. You acknowledged that but it's used as the Spanish to legitimate the conquest, and yet you also, of course, situate it in its proper setting, which the Spanish never fully understood. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you dealt with such really difficult questions as that.
The question of human sacrifice is a very big deal. And in fact, one very serious Mexican historian wrote in a review of the book, and I think fairly, that I whitewashed the situation. That is, she said I sanitize it too much. And I think in some ways she's right. I probably don't spend quite enough time facing head on that a central element of their religion was the sacrifice of human beings. But that certainly was conscious. That is because so much has been made of that. And we've been given the impression that all Aztecs worshiped death, loved death, had this hideous desire to cut out human hearts, that none of them even believed there would be a tomorrow if they didn't cut out human hearts. That I really wanted to move away from that, which I believe is a very wrong-headed view based on what's actually in what they wrote. So perhaps I sanitize, and the next person will walk the line better. But as I see it, the central element is that, yes, they did this, but so did all human beings at one point or another, we think. That is, archaeologists make the case that there's evidence for it in all continents.
Interesting.
And certainly it was widespread in North America. I mean, you who studied the American Revolution, you know, right, that sometimes prisoners were sacrificed by warriors of the enemy, right? Happens.
Iroquois stories are very similar.
Exactly. So that was but it was never, in general, it was never something that was practiced abusively. All warriors knew that if they were taken in war, this could happen to them. Women and children almost always were adopted. So what happened, though, is that amongst the Aztecs towards the end, and we don't know, we don't have dates for this, but it's very clear that towards the end of their century of power, they began to sacrifice people at a rate that no one had ever, that none of their people had ever, attempted before. And it was a power play. And we know this because it's in the sources. They talk about it. There's one very explicit one where the guy narrating to the young man who was writing this down says, this was, someone in the middle of the 1500s talking about when he was young. We used to go to the edge of the empire, places we wanted to conquer, take some people, bring them to the capital to witness the most horrible of the sacrifice ceremonies, and let them go, so that they would go home and tell their people, we should not get into a war with these folks. We should just join their empire voluntarily, because, boy, we do not want to have to send any prisoners home to Tenochtitlan, to the capital, to experience those ceremonies. So he was talking about it. It was a power calculation, and it worked. They terrified their neighbors, and partly as a result, their capital rose. But this was the political class doing this. When you look in their poems, their song, they used to sing poetry, there's a great lament of the need for death. So it's not fair to say that all the Aztecs all of the time sat around daydreaming about eating human hearts. That's actually ridiculous. But their leaders did. I guess it's fair. I think it's fair to compare it to what the worst people in our State Department did, and one might argue even the White House, during the 60s and 70s. I mean, we purposely backed death squads to run around Latin America terrorizing people in the middle of the night. That was, again, for similar reasons, I'd say, at the height of our power, we wanted to make sure nobody crossed us. Now, some people will be horrified that I'm, connecting the United States to human sacrifice, and perhaps that is a stretch. But my point is, military and civil political leaders sometimes do dreadful things when they want to maximize their power. It's not just the Aztecs.
No, and the use of terror in war is not a new thing, and you're right. It is unfortunately universal. But I was just saying the use of terror, I think, is a universal in war, and oftentimes using it in very sort of targeted, psychologically disturbing ways is not unusual. So, another question that I have, and this comes from my own position as a North American historian, but of course, the conquest of Mexico is a kind of foundational moment in the European indigenous relationship. I mean, it even though it's not the first encounter, but it's taken on that role. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that. And I'm aware that the first book by Camilla Townsend that I read was actually a book you wrote on Pocahontas. So I know you've thought of, at least given some thought to the Virginia dimension of this. Do you have thoughts about that? I mean, there are things that are very particular to the Aztecs in this story. And yet the motifs are established here, patterns that resonate throughout the Americas.
Yes, that is exactly how I see it. Now, as you know, Elijah, but some of the listeners might not, historians recently have made a great effort to kind of de-center the conquest of the Aztecs and to remind us that from the moment that Columbus began to run around the Caribbean all the way through probably to the very early 18th century, there was some part of the New World that was being attacked, and that the process of conquest took a long time, and that the Europeans never had it all their own way instantaneously. And I am a big believer in all of that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I do subscribe to the older view that you just articulated, that the conquest of Mexico does have a central role, not just in our imaginations, but really in what happened. The English spent a lot of time trying to replicate it. The Spaniards spent a lot of time trying to replicate it. And the pattern of indigenous people first kind of trading and making desultory attacks, and then trading again, and then eventually being conquered, but then resisting later. You see that unfold over and over again. So I do use it in teaching. I use the story in teaching to set up sort of the model of what's about to happen in the New World in multiple places and times. Although many historians see it differently.
Right. Yeah. But well, I mean, in Virginia, we know that the English are very, they've read these accounts, and we know that there are indigenous people in Virginia who also are familiar with parts of it on their own terms, and that's another one of those stories that it's really hard to get at. Because the records don't survive the way we would like to, but it's there's it's kind of a firstness, if that's a word, about the conquest of the Aztec Empire that then colors for all the participants how these later events happen. And that's not in any way to deny the extraordinary diversity of indigenous America and that dynamism. And that's a point that you also make beautifully, and you referred to it earlier. There is a tendency to reify or make static the indigenous. And in fact, it's an incredibly dynamic history.
Even people who don't want to do that sometimes end up doing it either out of unconscious bias or lack of sources. But right, it's so important that we fight against that tendency. Right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I'm wondering, I mean, this is, of course, we're in a very global moment, this may be an unfair question, but we can certainly see the importance of this to later Mexican history, to sort of a hemispheric history. Do you think there are lessons in this that apply even more broadly? I mean, it is a world historical event, the conquest of the Aztec Empire.
Well, I think there are two ways to look at that question. On one hand, there's no question that it mattered. That is, the Europeans, starting with the Spaniards, were about to take power over a whole other hemisphere. They were going to therefore have access to its material wealth, to the labor of its indigenous people. They were going to access land on which they would plant sugar and other crops that it sort of helped to inspire the international slave trade. So yes, on an economic and political level, these events really matter. Now, on a cultural level, that's another question. I recently sort of faced this head on because I was asked to give a talk in Japan, and they wanted to know why we all cared so much about Pocahontas and Malinche. And I thought I had brilliantly worked it out, and I was comparing it to various sort of spirit girls in some of their literature that are also intermediaries. But I don't think the talk went very well. And I think in retrospect, the reason is that other than a little blip of American occupation in the middle of the 20th century, the Japanese audience that I was talking to just was not familiar with the whole idea of one place having another culture overlaid on top, and then through the processes of hybridity or creolization or whatever you want to call it, ethnogenesis, the creation of a new way of being. This was just not something that they had been thinking about for years, the way we have in North America, the way Latin Americans have, and the way Europeans have whenever they're studying the Americas. So in that regard, this whole question of conquest and the long-term results of it, I think they seem to reverberate less in certain parts of the world than they do in this hemisphere. Right.
Yeah. And of course, you're talking here in comparative terms. There may not be a Japanese, an analogous event in Japanese history that would resonate. But of course, the other way to think about world history is a history of connection. And one of the things that I mean, there's so much I loved about this book, but I believe it's in the final chapter, you talk about how, along with the Spanish, this also, by the early 17th century, Mexico City, as it now is, has connections to the Philippines. They're Africans here. So that this is an opening not just to sort of an Iberian world, but it is truly, we're seeing connections to Asia and Africa as well as Europe.
Absolutely, right. The whole modern global world that we live in now, one could argue, really got started in a big way. It got started in many ways before. We just need to ask Peter Frankopan and other people on the committee, but in an international level between hemispheres, it really got started at this moment of the conquest of Mexico.
Right. Yes, and New Spain and Peru, the two Spanish viceroyalties, become real hinges, if you will, if that's or nodes. In this globalizing world. So it's a crucial moment in the first stage of globalization, isn't it? Yeah. So
absolutely.
Yeah, that's tapping into your own first field of economic history.
Right.
So well, I'm wondering, you've spoken a little bit about the some of the reviews. How has this been received by Nahuatl scholars, scholars really close to this?
The material. Right. I would say most of them, so far anyway, have really liked it. Except there is and that includes in Mexico, but there is a school within Mexico, well, that sounds like I'm talking about a specific group of people, and I'm not. There's a strand of thinking within Mexico that would take exception to anything that seems to sort of sanitize one side and, in their view, might come too close to vilifying the European element of their heritage. And then, too, we have to remember that there are many scholars, including in Mexico, who have had wonderful careers studying other indigenous language sources, albeit the ones written hand in hand with the friars. And so they may understandably feel that I'm trying to denigrate that work. And that really isn't my point at all.
Right.
It's essential. That was essential work and is essential work. It's also important, though, that we now begin to face the world of sources that were not written with us in mind.
Right.
But it's a both and in my mind.
Yes, and that's interesting. Again, it's one of these, there's shoals here to be, navigated carefully.
Right.
Certainly, one of the purposes that this conquest has served in the United States, and this goes back to the early English contact, is to set up an imperial example that first the English and later the U.S. was sure they would avoid. The seal of Massachusetts shows an indigenous American saying, "Come over and help us," and that may well reference, save us from these Spaniards, and so that's obviously something you also don't. I think you don't replicate that. I don't see that as a problem here, but that must have been something you were mindful of as well, particularly being.
Yes, I especially in the latter chapters where the Spaniards are involved, there's some terrible brutality. I tried in the opening vignettes to have some of the horrible incidents mirror some of the incidents before the conquest, because I certainly would not want to write anything that would seem to indicate that the Spaniards invented or the Europeans invented violence in that world. That would be preposterous. Right. I tried not to.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you did it very successfully. Again, I think this is a wonderful book. So, I think that we are. I think we're coming close to the end here, and I would just say to you again, it's a wonderful book. Thank you so much for writing it. It's such a gift to the reading public, and to anyone listening. This is a book you should definitely read, and I've certainly been recommending it to students, including in this survey class that I've referenced a couple times. When I finished my own lecture, I said, "Want to know more? Read this book."
Thank you so much. What a compliment. I can't thank you enough.
Well, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and I hope at some point we can meet in person.
Yes.
Our meetings have all been virtual, but
I too. I've seen you at a couple of conferences since the prize notice, but this virtual world, it's just not the same, right?
It's not the same. So eventually,
Thank
hopefully,
you.
we can shake hands and lift
Right.
a glass in person.
Right.
Thank you, Camilla and Elijah, for shedding light on the fascinating history and journey of the Aztecs. This was such an interesting conversation. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available at the Boulder bookstore. If you like the session, do consider supporting us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your support is greatly appreciated. Once again, we would like to thank all our official partners. We hope you all enjoyed these conversations and will tune back in for the next session. White Horse and Moon of the Crusted Snow. Bob Gieshig Rice and Erica T. Wurth in conversation with Maeve Conran at 5 p.m. MDT, 4:30 a.m. IST, 6 p.m. CT, and 4 p.m. PT. Thank you once again. And now presenting a reading from the JLF Writer Short series, Stepping Back by Anne Waldman.
I noticed I noticed the night. I noticed a new half moon. I noticed it looked liberated, sharp, piercing. The sky was clear. I noticed my panic. I heard remote birds. I noticed the beggar. I noticed the dancer. Hesitation, apprehension, speed, and speed I noticed. Someone fumbling with a slippery glove. I noticed a quarter. Here's something. Was money safe? Was larynx safe? Was sex safe? I noticed hesitation and how to think invincibly. That's what it means to be wise. Think before you touch. See what you cannot see. You can't touch. It's invisible. I noticed. I noticed someone was kind. I noticed efficacy. I noticed warning. I noticed signs signaled doom. Touch of optimism. I noticed rituals. I noticed shifts of mood, flicker. I noticed momentum. This was readiness is all. This was an almanac. I noticed closings, closure, cloisters. I noticed distraction. Shuddered. I noticed shuddered. Words closer to action. I noticed a book. I noticed poetry might save you now. Save you if you let it. It's time. Ward off, deflect, exercise, defy, apotropic experiments to shift the tone in danger, resistance, apo, away, trépain, to turn, make the day an amulet. And there were women everywhere across the land, children women, and girl women, and they women, and fluid women, and men who were women, and boy women, and women from the past on the tongues of mind and ear, and images of women everywhere, ancestor women out on the streets, and everyone woman that day, winning in Maynard heaven. But could earthly heart hold? The day said, I am woman. The day got up and walked this far and paused to take stock. It was the last chance to be observant and cry and stop and take stock. What worth if not be accountable? It would be theater, a spectacle. Come pay or come lie down in fluid bosom of woe, mankind. Centuries might wake up and spin out stories of how this got built. White supremacy, or on, or if, what wasn't liable, what was unleashed and damaged. You have to say it is severe this time. Blowback, perturbation this time. Traps of appetite this time. Rogue nukes. Say it to remind how the time might go on as a theater of dreams, of signs of this time, the signals go weirder, and you are on assignment every angle of the street, every minute, every day. Avert, deflect. All writing is in fact cut up. Avert, deflect. Every pilgrim theory is false and unsustainable in inclement weather. In the dream you stand in front of an ornate gate, but only by dancing will it open. Glamorous women had been fasting with games of break and entry disguised as beggars to confuse the upper echelons, but they continue to move phenomenologically, no longer objects or subjects of phallic desire. This time, apocalypse, this time. I notice startled words jump on the page. I notice my speed to stay alive. Speed is purpose, I noticed. Stand aside. Was something there? I noticed nothing. A subway stalled. I noticed anxiety. I noticed crying. people moving. Would I be subject for interrogation? Was I abiding? Was I living rules? I counted them. I am behaving. What did one know? No, this could be still empty. No, this could be full. I noticed breathing. I noticed someone freaking out at the bank. What he used to be, still elegant, but not what you see now, he told them. He told them not what you see now. He told them he used to be on with credit. I was one with credit, he said. I heard. I noticed. I noticed speed again. I noticed speed thinking itself a victor. Speed is a vector. No one saying what's going on when you are in business. Put on a face. I noticed how your faces are in my vocabulary now. I am in yours too, I noticed. When was the Federal Reserve created and by whom? Who was second in command to Jefferson Davis and considered the brains of the Confederacy? What was the primary material factor in British sea domination? And what was Ezra Pound right about? And how many things don't make sense about the Bering Straits theory of migration? And what might that mean? And what was Black Friday? Who funded the Confederacy and why? Stepping back, why does the term false flag sound odd? Where was Soha Bishara imprisoned? Why was she imprisoned? Who is she? And why do race and gender now seem so high on the US agenda? What does an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth actually mean? And what was Gertrude Stein wrong about? What are we talking about? Who were the silent sentinels? How many immigrants are in US detention centers on any given day? What are plutonium pits? What are jellyfish babies? I went to the garden of love and saw what I never had seen. I noticed out of pity. I noticed unheeding. I noticed the mirror and mind of wisdom. All things equal in the shimmering mirror, holding tight in brain. I noticed no one in the streets. I noticed the outcast and around the world, the broadcasts in my head. I noticed walking by. I noticed remembering how one touched a small thing gently and it expanded. A rail, a glass, a corner, a trigger, button to set off a bomb. How one stayed calm. I noticed her beautiful eyes closed. I noticed thinking, open them please, 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 open them, help me, help me. I noticed children. I noticed obedience. I noticed tender faces in routines. I noticed insouciance. I noticed determination. I noticed the listings, all the listings, what is missing, the numbers, the spikes going up. What I won't be able to notice, I noticed hesitating and stepping back. I was in the world. I noticed it. World, 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 world. The parks are closed, I noticed. I noticed the hardship of rain when you live on the street, longer than would be counting. This a whisper, enough of whisper to rise up and wiser streets of the world. Commission overheard a spin, a terrain, a soldiering one. She wanted to soldier out of here. She wanted what streets of the world to spin rubrics, eyes, yes, commerce, no, no, a no, no, tanks of the blown off world. I remembered Berlin before the wall came down. I remember things opening. I noticed elsewhere things closing down. Beirut. I noticed barriers and guns. I noticed shorter hours, longer days. I noticed the silver foil I dropped, afraid to pick it up, wipe it down. I noticed a cough. I remembered a conference in Wuhan, bustling city, the lake in happy translation. I noticed the care in transition, how far we came. And back a step, back a step, back a step. I noticed the invisible scourge, the invisible body, the invisible embrace. I noticed the child in the hallway stepping back. Oh, good, good, good. Stop there, I noticed. Oh, muse Melpomene, be your will, and by your will bind the laurel, and bring a bouquet, a calendar round to mark years, acclamation adversarial. We sing, but the light cease, congressional men go rounding out a hell, hill or house, step up elegy, what motivation, drive, tenebrosity, nuclear free them into fire, magic's protozoa, a rip or tear chose fuel or love's intensity, every divine apophatic wrong, what we don't have to ring, amuse, negatives times nexus, trick of fate, come melodious ones, mothers of sirens, success not be in sessions of patriarchy's charge, shocked from a page into mock triumph. It's over, it's over. Stepping back, I noticed what parts of the body shut down. Stepping back, I noticed what parts of the body, shut down. I noticed my eyes peering into screens, eyes awake and ears awake. I noticed my voice next to yours, noticing a continent away.
A festival like this is a beautiful indication of the kind of thing that I truly, truly believe in, and I think makes our society more whole and more pure.
We do not take it for granted that Boulder was chosen as the first North American satellite festival. It's a huge honor we will not forget, and we are enriched because of it. We are indebted to both the local and international people that came together to make that happen, and we hope it's a tradition that continues for decades to come.
Literary festivals like this one build up an environment and an ecosystem to nurture readers and to promote the business of books. They provide an invaluable forum for writers to connect with other creative people.
We sit there peering into those electronic grids in front of our eyes, and it only increases the desire to see the real thing in the flesh, to actually hear an author speak firsthand, to read from their work, to hear the tones of their voice modulate as they read their most treasured passages of prose.
For us, it's special. This was our mothership, and it continues to be. The other editions that we have across the United States are smaller versions, different programming, but smaller versions.
In a sense, to me, religion and art are the same thing. They're vaguely irrational, but they help make sense of things. Someone who lives with no arts and no religion has very little to live on.
2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom.
You have to think of viruses as intelligent machines, as code crackers. And like all living forms, they have to adapt to their environment.
Imagination is a powerful tool. It doesn't matter which part of the world we are in our situation. Are we behind locked bars? Are we roaming freely? Independent thought and process. Our imagination allows us to soar out of any present circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that really is the power of literature and the written word. It allows us to envision a better future. It allows us to consider our past and make sense of the present. Imagination is a tool to be able to free us from the binds and the constrictions that we find ourselves locked into. We can break free. We can soar through the universe. We can rise up into the darkened night like a firefly, illuminating the world. This is what JLF Boulder, Colorado hopes to bring you, something to fire your imagination.